The hum of the transmitter filled the small, dimly lit radio station as Jacob Ferris leaned back in his chair, the red, on-air sign casting a faint glow on the cluttered desk. Midnight had come and gone, and the world outside was silent, just how Jacob liked it. As the host of Nocturnal Frequencies, a local late-night radio show, Jacob's job was simple: keep the insomniacs and night owls entertained with eerie tales and unsolved mysteries. But tonight, the air felt heavier, the darkness thicker, as if the night itself were holding its breath. He adjusted his headphones and leaned into the microphone. "All right, night dwellers, this next story is a real bone chiller. But before that, let's take a call. Line 1, you're live on Nocturnal Frequencies. What's on your mind?" The line crackled, and Jacob frowned. "Hello, line 1, you're on the air." A burst of static flooded his headphones, sharp and deafening. Then, a voice, distorted, low, and impossible to pinpoint, cut through the noise. "You shouldn't have tuned in." Jacob's blood ran cold. "Excuse me, who is this?" The static rose again, drowning out the voice, but not before Jacob caught its final words. "They're listening now." The phone went dead. Jacob stared at the receiver, his pulse hammering in his ears. The transmitter's hum grew louder, almost like a heartbeat. For the first time in his career, Jacob wondered if his show had gone too far. Jacob Ferris wasn't just any late-night host. At 38, he had spent over a decade building his reputation as the voice of midnight mysteries, blending wit and curiosity, with just enough skepticism to keep his listeners engaged. His show, Nocturnal Frequencies, wasn't the most popular on the airwaves, but it had a loyal following of insomniacs, truck drivers, and conspiracy theorists who tuned in religiously. The station itself, KRXF 107.5, sat at the edge of town in an old brick building that had seen better days. Most of the staff worked during the daylight hours, leaving Jacob and his sound engineer, Ben, to hold down the fort at night. It wasn't glamorous, but Jacob loved the quiet solitude of the late shift. Except tonight, the quiet felt oppressive. After the strange call, Jacob glanced at the clock, 12:17 a.m. There were still nearly 4 hours of airtime left. Shaking off the unease, he turned to his producer's booth, expecting to see Ben's reassuring thumbs up. But the booth was empty. "Ben?" Jacob called, his voice breaking the silence. No answer. A faint flicker of movement on the soundboard caught his eye. The levels were jumping erratically, as though someone were speaking into a live microphone. But Jacob hadn't touched the controls. "Is this a prank?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Taking a deep breath, he returned to the microphone. "Apologies for the interruption. Folks, let's dive into tonight's main story. A chilling tale about the lost hikers of Black Ridge Forest." He began his narration, but the words felt hollow, his mind replaying the caller's cryptic warning. Halfway through the story, a sharp burst of static cut him off. He yanked off his headphones as a deep, droning hum filled the studio. The transmitter light on the soundboard blinked wildly. And then, through the static, came a sound that made Jacob's blood run cold, a faint voice whispering his name. "Jacob." He froze. "Ben, is that you?" The whisper grew louder, overlapping itself in eerie layers. It wasn't Ben. It didn't sound human at all. Jacob stared at the soundboard, his hands trembling. The voice faded, replaced by another burst of static. Then the lights flickered. Jacob stood up, scanning the room. The station suddenly felt larger, darker, as though the shadows had stretched to fill every corner. He grabbed his phone and dialed Ben's number, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Okay, think," Jacob whispered, pacing the studio. Maybe it was a technical glitch. Old equipment like this was prone to acting up. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a glitch. His thoughts were interrupted by the station's emergency broadcast alert, a shrill tone that echoed through the building. The alert system hadn't been used in years, and Jacob hadn't triggered it. The red on-air light blinked erratically as the emergency tone faded, replaced by a low guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine. The voice returned, clearer now, but still distorted. "Don't ignore the signal." Jacob leaned into the soundboard microphone, his voice shaky. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the static morphed into something stranger, a faint melody, haunting and discordant like a warped lullaby. Then the phone lines lit up, all of them. Jacob had never seen all 5 lines active at once. He hesitated before answering the first. "Hello," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Static greeted him, followed by a single sentence spoken in an unfamiliar voice. "It's already here." The line went dead. Jacob stared at the phone as a sense of dread settled over him. He answered the next call, and the one after that, but each was the same, different voices, the same cryptic warning. "It's already here." Jacob turned to the window overlooking the parking lot. Beyond the glass, the streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows. A figure stood near the edge of the lot, motionless and shrouded in darkness. The transmitter's hum grew louder, filling the studio like a physical force. Jacob grabbed his jacket and bolted for the door, determined to find Ben and get out of the station. As he stepped into the hallway, the fluorescent lights above him buzzed and dimmed. The air felt thicker, charged with electricity. "Ben?" Jacob called, his voice echoing off the walls. A faint sound reached his ears, footsteps, slow and deliberate. He followed them to the break room, but it was empty. The static grew louder, almost deafening, as Jacob turned to leave. That's when he saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, its face obscured by a haze of shifting shadows. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't human. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, and then spoke in the same layered voice he'd heard through the static. "The signal binds us, you can't run." Jacob's heart raced as he backed away from the figure, the chilling voice echoing in his mind. The hallway felt like it was closing in on him, the shadows twisting into monstrous shapes that threatened to consume him. He turned on his heel and sprinted back to the studio, slamming the door shut behind him. He was breathing hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. "This isn't happening," he muttered, trying to rationalize the encounter. The late-night solitude had surely warped his mind, playing tricks on him. But as he glanced at the soundboard, a wave of unease washed over him. The station's equipment had begun to flicker and buzz with an unsettling energy. The static swirled in the air, thick and oppressive, as if it had taken on a life of its own. Jacob reached for the controls, desperate to regain some sense of normalcy. "Come on, Ben," he whispered. "Where are you?" He turned on the microphone, his voice steady but shaky. "Folks, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please bear with us." But the static didn't quiet. It grew louder, drowning out his words. Suddenly, a cacophony of whispers erupted from the speakers, voices overlapping, all clamoring for attention. Jacob could hear them distinctly now, calling his name, warning him. "Jacob, Jacob." He grabbed the headphones, his hands trembling, and plugged them in. The whispers surged, a chaotic symphony of fear. Leave now, one voice urged. Stay with us, another insisted. The back and forth was maddening. Jacob yanked the headphones off, pressing his palms against his ears to block the sound. He needed to think. He had to get out. Then he remembered the emergency broadcast system. If he could reach the outside world, maybe he could alert someone. With a surge of determination, he dashed to the emergency controls, hoping they still worked after all these years. The system was ancient, with dusty buttons and faded labels, but as he flipped the switch, the air buzzed with static before crackling into life. This is Jacob Ferris of KRXF 107.5, he announced, his voice echoing with urgency. We're experiencing an emergency situation at the station. If anyone is listening, please send help. The static cut him off again, and he felt a sudden chill. The temperature dropped, and the lights flickered. Help won't come, the shadowy figure from before whispered, now looming in the corner of the studio, its form indistinct, but its presence unmistakably real. You've opened the door, they're already here. Jacob backed away from the controls, fear gripping him. He glanced toward the windows. Outside, the world was shrouded in darkness, the streetlights flickering ominously. Ben, he shouted, his voice rising in panic. Where the hell are you? A moment later, the studio door swung open, and Ben stumbled in, his face pale and his eyes wide. Jacob, what's going on? I heard the static from the control room. I don't know, Jacob shouted, rushing to Ben. We have to get out of here, now. But as they moved toward the door, the lights above them went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Jacob fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight as a dim beam cut through the gloom. In that brief light, he caught a glimpse of the figure again, closer now, its eyes two glimmering voids that seemed to swallow the light. Jacob, Ben shouted, his voice breaking through the darkness. What is that? I don't know, but it's not human, we have to leave. They stumbled toward the exit, but the figure blocked their path, its voice hissing through the static. You can't escape the signal. In a burst of desperation, Jacob lunged forward, pushing against the darkness. He felt a cold grip tighten around his throat, constricting like a vice. The whispers intensified, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. You're one of us now. Jacob, Ben yelled, reaching for him. Hold on. With a surge of adrenaline, Jacob twisted away from the figure's grasp. The flashlight flickered wildly, illuminating the room in erratic bursts of light. The figure staggered back, momentarily disoriented. Run! Jacob shouted, grabbing Ben by the arm. They bolted for the door, shoving past the figure as the static roared, drowning out their screams. They stumbled into the hallway, the cold air slapping them like a wave. They ran, ignoring the cries of the whispers behind them, racing down the dark corridor toward the exit. As they reached the front door, Jacob fumbled with the lock, hands shaking. The static seemed to grow louder, a thunderous cacophony filling the air. Come on, Ben urged, glancing over his shoulder. Hurry. Finally, with a click, the door swung open, and they dashed outside into the cool night air. But the moment they stepped into the open, the whispers fell silent. They stood outside the station, gasping for breath, the stars twinkling above them like distant eyes. Did we make it? Ben asked, looking back at the building. I think so, Jacob replied, uncertainty creeping in. But as they turned to leave, a faint hum filled the air, and the streetlights flickered ominously. Jacob's heart sank. Jacob. the voice echoed softly, resonating in the darkness. They turned to see the figure standing at the entrance of the station, its presence looming. "No," Jacob breathed. "We can't go back." "It's already inside us," the figure whispered, the voice reverberating with a chilling finality. "The signal is eternal." The shadows thickened around them, the whispers rising again, swirling in a maelstrom of sound. The night air vibrated with the pulse of the static, alive and hungry. As the figure advanced, Jacob grabbed Ben's arm. "We have to find a way to cut the signal, permanently." They turned and ran, their hearts pounding, the whispers echoing behind them, promising that the night was just beginning. Jacob and Ben sprinted through the parking lot, the oppressive static pulsing in the air around them. The shadowy figure was no longer just an apparition. It had become a nightmare, an entity fueled by the signals they had unwittingly awakened. "We need to get to my car," Jacob shouted, urgency fueling his words. "If we can drive far enough away, maybe we can escape the signal." They reached Jacob's old sedan, fumbling with the locks as the static intensified, vibrating through the metal. Just as Jacob got the door open, a cold wind swept through the lot, and the lights began to flicker even more violently. "Get in," Jacob urged, pushing Ben toward the passenger seat before jumping into the driver's side. He turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered, refusing to start. Panic set in as he turned the key again, but the same thing happened. Nothing. "Come on," Ben shouted, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, its form shifting in and out of the shadows, almost as if it were waiting for them to give in to fear. Jacob's hands trembled on the steering wheel. "I think the signal is blocking the car." Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, the familiar voice of Jacob's own show spilling out, but warped and distorted. The voice echoed in the car, overlaying his own, the static drowning out any sense of clarity. "You can't escape the signal," his voice repeated through the radio. "It will always find you." Ben grabbed the radio dial, trying to turn it off, but it only got louder. "Jacob, we have to do something." As the static surged, Jacob's eyes darted around the parking lot, searching for anything they could use. And then he saw it, the emergency broadcast transmitter mounted on the roof of the station. "It has to be the transmitter," Jacob shouted, an idea forming in his mind. "If we can reach it and shut it down, maybe we can sever the connection." "But it's too risky," Ben argued, glancing back at the figure, which was now moving closer. "We won't make it." "I won't let it win," Jacob shot back, determination igniting within him. "If I don't do this, we're trapped forever." Without waiting for Ben's response, Jacob flung open the door and bolted toward the station, adrenaline propelling him forward. He could hear Ben calling after him, but he didn't stop. As he approached the building, the air crackled with energy, and the whispers intensified, swirling around him like a cyclone. The door swung open on its own, as if beckoning him inside. Jacob hesitated for a moment, but he pressed on, racing through the darkness of the hallway toward the stairs leading to the roof. Each step felt heavier, the shadows closing in as he ascended. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices echoing in his mind. "You can't leave, you can't escape." Reaching the rooftop, Jacob was met with the sight of the emergency transmitter, its red light blinking ominously. He rushed toward it, feeling the weight of the signal pressing against him like a physical force. The static outside was deafening, the noise resonating through the building. He reached the transmitter, heart pounding, and began to search for the main switch. Just then, Ben burst through the door, breathless. "Jacob, we need to hurry." I know, Jacob replied, his hands trembling as he scanned the panel for the switch. The figure loomed in the doorway behind Ben, shadows twisting and contorting, as if the darkness itself had come alive. Turn it off, Ben urged, glancing back nervously. With a surge of panic, Jacob found the switch and flipped it. Nothing happened. He cursed under his breath, turning to look at Ben, whose face was pale with fear. The figure stepped into the light, its form becoming clearer, a mass of writhing shadows and flickering lights. Jacoby, it hissed, the voice a twisted amalgamation of whispers, both alluring and terrifying. Join us. Jacob shook his head, his resolve hardening. No, I won't be part of this. He turned back to the transmitter, a last-ditch effort to save themselves. In the back of his mind, he recalled the emergency override he had read about long ago, a way to break the signal entirely. But it required one final push, a risk he would have to take. With trembling hands, Jacob turned the dial to the emergency frequency and pressed down hard on the override button, feeling a surge of energy course through him. The static intensified, and the air vibrated with power. Jacob, Ben shouted, panic rising in his voice. What are you doing? It's the only way, Jacob yelled back, fighting to hold on to his resolve. He could feel the shadows closing in, the figure reaching for him, its fingers stretching out like tendrils of darkness. As the transmitter hummed with energy, a blinding light enveloped the rooftop, casting the figure into the shadows. Jacob gritted his teeth, channeling everything he had into the override, willing the signal to break. The whispers reached a fever pitch, merging into a single, chilling scream as the energy surged around them. The very fabric of reality seemed to ripple, and Jacob felt himself being pulled between worlds. Then, with one final push, the signal shattered. A deafening silence followed, like the calm after a storm. The light blinked out, and Jacob collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The figure was gone, its presence dissolved into nothingness. Ben rushed to Jacob's side, helping him up. Did it work? Jacob looked around the rooftop, the darkness now replaced by the soft glow of the stars above. The static was gone, and the air felt lighter, almost refreshing. I think so, Jacob replied, still breathless. I think we did it. But as they descended the stairs, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. The station felt emptier, the echoes of the static now just a memory. We need to leave, Ben urged, glancing back nervously. Jacob nodded, and they stepped outside, the night air wrapping around them like a soothing embrace. But as they reached Jacob's car, the lights flickered one last time, and a soft whisper danced in the wind. Until next time. Jacob and Ben stood by the car, their breath visible in the cool night air, as they processed what had just happened. The eerie quiet of the parking lot felt both freeing and unsettling. The familiar surroundings of the radio station seemed different now, as if the shadows were still waiting to reclaim their hold. Did we really just? Ben began, but his voice trailed off, unable to articulate the horror they had experienced. Jacob leaned against the hood of the car, staring at the now quiet station. I think so, but we have to be careful. The signal might be gone, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Ben nodded, his eyes flicking nervously toward the building. We should report this. Someone needs to know what happened. Yeah, Jacob replied, pushing himself off the car. But we have to make sure it's safe first. They got into the car, Jacob turning the key in the ignition. To his relief, the engine roared to life. As they drove away from KRXF 107.5, The night stretched out before them, the road illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. Yet, even as they distanced themselves from the station, Jacob couldn't shake the whispers that seemed to linger in the back of his mind. What if it's still out there? What if it finds a new way to come back? Ben glanced at Jacob, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. We just severed the connection, it has to be over. Maybe, Jacob replied, but doubt crept into his thoughts. But we can't let our guard down. As they continued to drive, the weight of their experience settled between them like a thick fog. The quiet of the night, once comforting, now felt oppressive. Jacob flipped on the radio, hoping to drown out the silence. To his surprise, the station had returned to its normal programming, a soft, soothing voice speaking over gentle music. But even as the familiar sounds filled the car, Jacob felt an unease wash over him. "What do you want to listen to?" Ben asked, his fingers tapping nervously on the dashboard. "I don't know," Jacob replied, unable to focus on anything but the shadows still haunting his mind. "Just something normal." They drove on, the road stretching endlessly before them, illuminated by the glow of the dashboard. Eventually, the conversation turned lighter, discussing trivial things, work plans for the weekend, and how they would explain the night's events to their friends. But as they entered the town, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure trailing behind them. Instead, he saw only darkness, an empty road stretching into the distance. "Do you think anyone else heard it?" Ben asked, breaking the silence. "Maybe," Jacob said thoughtfully. "But I don't know if anyone would believe us." The thought lingered in the air, and for a moment, Jacob felt the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. Would they ever truly escape the echoes of the signal? As they reached Jacob's apartment building, he turned off the engine and sat in silence, lost in thought. "We should stay together tonight," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Just in case." Ben nodded, grateful for the idea. "Yeah, I don't want to be alone after everything." They climbed out of the car and made their way to the entrance, the night still thick with tension. Jacob held the door open for Ben, but as they stepped inside, a faint whisper flitted through the air, barely audible. "Jacob." He froze, looking around, but there was no one there. It was just the wind, he told himself. Just the wind. They ascended the stairs, and as they reached Jacob's apartment, he felt the weight of the night pressing heavily on his chest. "We'll figure it out," he reassured Ben, but his voice wavered. Inside, they sat on the couch, the glow of the TV providing a sense of normalcy. They talked for hours, filling the silence with stories and laughter, but deep down, Jacob knew the specter of the night lingered. As dawn approached, the sky lightened outside, and Jacob glanced at the window, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the darkness. For the first time that night, he felt a flicker of hope. "Maybe we really did escape," he whispered, turning to Ben, who nodded with a weary smile. But even as the sun rose, illuminating the room, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the signal was still out there, waiting for its chance to return. As the first light of dawn spilled into the room, illuminating the remnants of their fears, Jacob turned to Ben and whispered, "We're safe for now." But deep within, he felt the chilling reminder of that night lingering in the back of his mind, a signal still pulsing, still waiting, and he knew they had only just begun to scratch the surface of the darkness that would come again. The two friends exchanged weary smiles, their bond strengthened by the shared terror, but as they sat together in the soft morning light, the whispers faded into silence, an uneasy calm settling over them, a reminder that, in the world of shadows and signals, the haunting echoes of the past are never truly gone.